Content note: the romance of a rogue contains unhealthy relationship dynamics and the romanticization of stalking. Listen at your own risk. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I'm excited to read to you from The Romance of a Rogue by Ruby M. Ayres. Chapter 10. When Bruce reached the Smithers' house, he found Stella and her mother alone. "My husband has had to go out on business," Mrs. Smithers told him. "He is such a busy man that we cannot be sure of having him with us even on Sunday. But I am sure he will not be long. I told him we hoped you were coming." But Mr. Smithers was not in to supper, and at 9 o'clock he had still not returned. Bruce sat with the two women in the drawing-room and listened while they talked. "You're very quiet," Stella said suddenly, and he roused himself with an effort to answer. "I'm sorry. I'm afraid I've got into a habit of silence." "Stella is wondering whether you care about dancing," Mrs. Smithers said. "Like all young people, she is very fond of it, and if you would care to—" Bruce interrupted hurriedly. "I'm afraid I don't dance. Thank you all the same. It's years since I tried, and then I could only manage to get through an old-fashioned waltz or lancers. Dancing has changed so, hasn't it?" he added, remembering the queer steps and twists which old Christopher and his orchestra accompanied night after night. "You ought to learn the new steps, Mr. Lowry," Stella said rather wistfully. She was young, and Bruce had touched her imagination. She knew something of his history, and imagined a good deal more, and true to her modern upbringing, pity for him wiped out any horror or fear she might have felt. Bruce shook his head. There was a time, perhaps, but not now. "The time will come again," Mrs. Smithers said kindly, but he shook his head. Stella had gone out of the room then, and her mother leaned forward suddenly and laid her hand on Bruce Lowry's arm. "Won't you let us help you to forget the past?" she asked gently. He sat very still, his eyes fixed unwaveringly before him, and she went on. "To those who know the truth, forgiveness and understanding are both so possible, Mr. Lowry." "You're very kind," he laughed. "I am afraid my brother would hardly agree with your sentiments. There are always uncharitable people in the world." He was conscious of her kindness, and though he appreciated it, he did not desire it. There was only one woman in the world whose touch could heal him, and she would have none of him. He moved restlessly, and Mrs. Smithers drew her hand away as Stella came back into the room. She sat down on the rug at her mother's feet and smiled at Bruce. "Father's just come in," she said. Mrs. Smithers rose. "Then I must go and see if he has had his supper." She went hurriedly away, and Stella laughed. "Mother always fusses over father so," she said. Bruce looked down at her. "Isn't that rather nice?" She nodded. "Yes, I think it is. I think it's beautiful when married people stay in love with one another always, like father and mother. But then, of course, people always would if they really loved each other properly to start with." He smiled amusedly. She seemed such a child to him. "You believe in really loving properly, then?" he asked. "Of course." Her brown eyes shone. "I know if I ever loved a man, I should love him always. Always, no matter what he did or what happened." He shook his head. "You think so now, perhaps, but if the test came, you would wait to hear what the world said, and then let the world convince you that it was right if they called him a thief or a liar or a—" He did not finish, and after a moment she said slowly, "I know what you're thinking of. Of course. And Mr. Lowry, I would never have done what she did." "What she did?" he repeated uncertainly. She nodded. She was flushed, and there were tears in her pretty eyes. "Don't be angry," she appealed, "but Mother told me all about you and—" She held her hand to him across the firelit space dividing them. "Oh, I am sorry. Sorry?" He looked at the kind little hand, but made no movement to take it. "You mean that you could forgive even murder?" he asked. Her eyes did not falter. "Yes, if I loved you." There was a little silence. Then he made a swift gesture of repudiation. "You don't know what you were saying. You were only a child. You don't understand the world and its standard of judgment." He broke off as Mrs. Smithers came back into the room, followed by her husband. There was a little desultory conversation. Then Bruce said he must go. "And come again soon. We shall always be pleased to see you," Mrs. Smithers told him, but Stella shook hands silently. By the way, Lowry, Mr. Smithers said with a trace of embarrassment as the two men went out into the hall, I saw your brother this evening, and I believe, with a little tact, he stopped awkwardly as Bruce turned and faced him with hard eyes. Yes, he questioned. Mr. Smithers shrugged his shoulders. After all, you are brothers, he said deprecatingly. Bruce got into his overcoat. It was he who first found it convenient to forget the fact, he answered. He walked home with a feeling of sore anger. What had Smithers said to Edward, he wondered. He wanted no intervention. He was quite capable of managing his own affairs. Edward himself had laid down the lines on which their future relationship was to be conducted, and he would see that those lines were adhered to strictly. Then he thought suddenly of Stella, and of his question to her. You mean that you could forgive even murder? And her answer, Yes, if I loved you. It gave him a strange thrill to recall her words and the tears in her eyes. She was only a child, but her heart had been warm towards him. It had been sweet to hear her say in her innocence that she would have forgiven him, even though he knew by bitter experience that had the test come to her, she would have failed him as Charmian had done. Christopher was in bed and asleep when he got back to the Edgware Road, but Beauty stirred, opened one eye, and wagged a feathery tail in lazy greeting. The lamp burned dimly on the center table, and there was a letter propped conspicuously against it. The color beat into Bruce Lowry's face as he recognized the writing as his brother's. Then he stooped, took the letter up in the tips of his fingers, and without opening it, dropped it onto the coals that still smoldered redly in the grate. To Christopher's amazement, Bruce refused to accompany him to the Elixir Hall the following night. He was tired, he said, and should go to bed early. I'm not used to the late hours we've been keeping, you know, he apologized with bitterness. But there was a little worried frown on Christopher's brow as he left the house with Beauty at his heels, and when he reached the hall, he went at once to Charmian. Good evening, Miss Lee. Good evening, she answered in her usual listless way, but Christopher was quick to notice that her eyes went past him, as if expecting he would not be alone, and after a few moments she asked, Your friend is not coming tonight? No. I asked him, but he begged to be excused. He has another, more attractive engagement, perhaps, she said, with a note of irony, but her lips trembled. Christopher looked at her gravely, but made no answer, and it was some time before she spoke again, and then, in an interval between the dancing, she said, irrelevantly, What did you do last night, John? He looked up from carefully polishing the case of his violin. I slept. She raised her brows. What? All the evening, he smiled. I believe I was guilty of such an enormity. She turned the pages of her music score. What dull company you must have been, she said. Beauty did not complain, Christopher answered, and she was my sole companion. He saw a faint flush mount to her brow, and heard the elaborate carelessness in her voice as she said, Your friend no longer lives with you, then? He disguised a smile. Yes, but he was out dining last night. So she was not so disinterested in Bruce as she would have it appear, and that being so, it seemed to Christopher that she deserved punishment for failing to keep her appointment with him. I'm glad everyone has not forsaken him, he said presently. I'm glad that all the world is not hard and unforgiving. She turned startled eyes. What do you mean? She asked, and he answered gravely, that my friend has suffered, and that there are many people who would not let him forget, who would make him suffer still, if they had their way. She sat silent for some moments, tapping her bow against the brass music stand before her. Then suddenly she said, Perhaps he deserves to suffer still. No, said Christopher. You are his champion, she accused him. He shrugged his narrow shoulders. Perhaps. It is only those who are unfairly treated who need a champion. She laughed mirthlessly. Life has been unfair to me, but I have never found a champion. His melancholy eyes softened as they rested on her face. Perhaps you will not accept him, he said, and, because she turned her face away and would not answer, he knew that she understood his meaning. It was at 11 o'clock, when the interval came for supper, that she said to him as he rose to leave the platform, Of course, he told you that I knew him years ago? Her eyes hotly challenged him. I did not need to be told, Christopher answered. He waited a moment, then he added gently, You were not very kind to him yesterday, my dear. Kind? She laughed bitterly. Has he been kind to me? Christopher returned to his seat beside her. Believe me, it is his only desire, he said earnestly. She turned her head away. "Where was he last night?" she asked in a stifled voice. "I told you. He dined with a friend." "A friend," she repeated. "A Mr. Smithers, a solicitor," Christopher explained. "Is he married?" she asked heartily. "I believe so." After a moment, "And he has a daughter," she said. "I do not know," Christopher answered. She looked at him. "I know. I saw her in the park yesterday with Mr. Lowry." So she was jealous. Christopher did not know what to say, but she seemed to expect no answer. She turned her back on him almost rudely and began to talk to the cornet player who sat on her right, and when Christopher looked for her before he left the hall, she had already gone. And that is the end of Chapter 10 of The Romance of a Rogue by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter with me, and I hope you return soon for the next one. Have a great day. Bye!